Welcome back, everyone. It's time for our March Civil War Roundtable. It's a beautiful day outside, which kind of makes me feel a little reluctant to be inside, but glad that you all came out today. A couple announcements. There are two Civil War symposiums coming up. There's one in Mankato. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, the one in Mankato is on the 26th on Saturday. The deadline for signing up is the 21st. There is, if you look at the Friends of Boy in Blue Civil War Memorial online, there's an online option and a mail-in option for registration. You can, so it's $25 and that includes lunch. And if you're a member of the Friends group, you get a discount of $5. Let's see what else. It starts at 9 o'clock at the VFW on Riverfront Drive. So, anything else that you'd like to know? We'll be talking, the main speaker is Nancy Kester, who's written a book on Harriet Tubman in her spiritual life. And her great-grandfather was Captain Keith Kaiser, who was in the Betsy Tacy family. So if you have all those historic things up here, those are the connections.
All right. Thank you.
We're registered to go, but is it going to be, are the programs going to be online?
There's also an online option, yes.
Yeah, we did the Zoom thing.
Okay, so there's an in-person option and an online option. Thank you for bringing that up, because I forgot about it. And I think the online is only $15. So,
Without lunch.
yeah, there's no lunch. You make your own. But yeah, there's an online portion too. So.
Then the State Civil War Symposium is going to be on.
Just
one more thing, Tom?
condition is that if you want to go and eat lunch, you can only get lunch if you pre-register. If you show up the day of,
It's pretty tough.
Yeah.
you have to go somewhere else to eat.
Good point.
Unfortunately, I'll have to miss it this year.
Oh. Darn.
So the State Civil War Symposium is Saturday, April 2nd, so the following week, and that's going to be up in Bloomington. If you'd like more details about that, send me an email, and I can get you the registration form to fill out, and it has all the accompanying details on there. But with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. So as a roundtable, this is a public forum, which means we can all share information, we can all ask questions, we can all have the opportunity to present if we like, or recommend presenters, and so feel free to do so. We're happy to have people come. As I was looking through different topics, thinking about what could be something else I could present about, and I hit on railroads in the Civil War, and I came across the website AmericanRails.com. And the editor, Adam Burns, had written this research article about the use of railroads in the Civil War. So I contacted him and said, can you present on this, or do I have your permission to adapt it for presentation? And he said, sure, you can adapt it. And so I'm grateful for his initial research, and a lot of the photographs came from the research that he did. And then I also have some additional content from the National Archives and the National Medal of Honor Museum as well. So for topics today, we've got a few. So where were the railroads located? What challenges did railroads have during the war? How were railroads used, by the Union and by the Confederacy? And how did railroads impact the course of the war? So those are the big questions we'll take a look at for our meeting here tonight. So let's start with where were the railways? When fighting broke out in 1861, there were more than 30,000 miles of rail in the United States. Of that 30,000, 21,300 miles was in Union-controlled territory. So over 2/3 was in Union hands. 9,022 miles were in Confederate-controlled territory. But on the Confederate side, most of their railroads were built in the 1850s. So many of their railroads were newer, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were better. But they were newer. In addition, railways often paralleled telegraph lines, so transport and communication were linked. The Union had 45,000 miles of telegraph wire. And on the other hand, the Confederacy had 5,000 miles of telegraph wire. So you can already see that there is a big communication and logistical difference between the Union and the Confederacy at the outbreak of the war. Okay, so here we have Lloyd's American Railroad map from 1861. I've highlighted here the four main lines that connected the Union to the Confederacy. So you can see even by 1861, there are huge railroad networks all the way through what was then termed the Far West. You see there's areas here, of course, restricted by terrain. You've got, in places, the Appalachians, the Adirondacks, the Smoky Mountains, all of those, as well as rivers, presented issues with rails going through. So you've really got four major connecting points between the North and the South. And with that in mind, we'll talk about some issues to start with. So one of the first big issues was that rail gauges weren't standard yet. And so rail gauge, remember, is the size and shape of the actual rail that the wheels run on. You can think of it as trying to put on a shoe that doesn't fit and trying to walk around in it, but with a 50-ton train. It creates some problems. Not even for the same company or in the same state were rail gauges standard. And so here we have the different types of gauges that there were. So narrow gauge has 24 inches between it, so this is really small rail lines. There was also a 30-inch narrow gauge and a 36-inch narrow gauge. Standard gauge was 56.5 inches. Broad gauge was 5 feet. And then there was dual gauge, which had a partition that could shift. You saw this a lot with junctions, but then you also saw it for trains that were carrying more stable straight line loads for shipping and such. You also saw that there were a lack of bridges over major rivers. So you've got the Ohio River system, the Missouri River system, the Mississippi, and then rivers through the South as well. All of these presented challenges to expanding the railroad, especially with the war breaking out. You have less people for engineering projects because they're being put into combat instead. And there was also a dispute over the transcontinental line. So the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 said, and there had been discussion in Congress before this point, about making a rail line that goes all the way to the West Coast. But President Lincoln and Congress enacted the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 during the war, which designated a route for railroads to go west. And it was amended in 1864, and it established a focus on a central rail line headed west from Missouri, but then split off into the Northern Pacific Railway, headed up towards Oregon and Washington, and then the Central Line, which headed west, and eventually the completion point was at in Utah, where they drove the Golden Spike. So we're not done yet.
Comment,
Sure.
the Civil War was allowed the Transcontinental Railroad to be built because the South had been opposing the Transcontinental
Exactly.
Railroad.
They had.
Once the Confederacy left, it was smooth sailing to get the Transcontinental
That's it. It's a very good point.
passed.
And
The big mistake was picking Omaha as the terminus instead of Chicago, but that was good for Iowa.
Okay. So destruction and vandalism was common practice of rail lines during the war, which required taking men away from combat to protect, repair, build, and rebuild. This is the rail bridge over the North Anna River in Virginia. This was taken May 25th, 1864, so this is a little bit later in the war, but you can see that's quite a lot of work to put back together. So it created a lot of problems in that way. But because of that destruction and vandalism, we also have the creation of the first armored rail car. So this is at Bull Run in the spring of 1863. Here's the armored car right here. You see it has a cannon sticking out the side. The trains had armored cars near the engine to be able to protect the train as it traveled. Okay. So Union leadership recognized the logistical value of the railroad. This is a mobile mortar cart, and so this is known as the Dictator, which is was a large mortar board used during the siege of Petersburg in 1865. And because it's mobile, you can change your angle, position, especially with heavy machinery. It was a lot easier to shift than having it be horse-drawn if there were rail lines nearby. This is City Point, Virginia, also during the siege of Petersburg. And so supplies would be brought in by ship, and then you see to get them off the dock, they would use rail lines to pull them up and move them quickly into the city. Okay, so one of the things that the Union did was they created the United States Military Railroad in 1862, commonly abbreviated as USMR. They were not in direct command of combat troops. It was a division of the Army, but they were led by General Daniel C. McCallum, and he was formerly a general manager of the Erie Railroad. He was the administrator, and then General Herman Haupt was the right-hand man of General McCallum in the USMR, and he was formerly the chief engineer of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He was recognized by President Lincoln specifically for rebuilding the Potomac Creek Bridge, among other accomplishments that he had. What General Haupt did with the Potomac Creek Bridge is nothing short of amazing. He rebuilt it in the rain with inexperienced laborers and a lack of tools in 9 days, using primarily corn stalks and bean poles. But if you don't believe me, there's a picture. So the railroad ties, of course, those all had to be, but all of this truss work here was built in 9 days with an inexperienced labor force and a lack of tools, using corn stalks and bean poles. That's amazing. And so you can see why President Lincoln said, this guy's got some efficiency here.
Well, not too much different than the way railroads were built at that time, because it was mostly immigrant labor.
Mhm.
Most people who
Didn't
were hired
know,
onto the
yeah.
railroad to build them learned on the job.
So this is an actual map of the U.S. military railroads used in the Civil War. So this map was created by General McCallum in 1866 after the end of the war. And so you can see there were red lines, and then there are blue lines. Those are differences in the gauges. But any of them that are highlighted with colors were either used, created, or taken over by the U.S. military. Okay, so a little bit more about them. Military Railroad coordinated troop and supply movements. So this was after the capture of Nashville. These are Union locomotives in 1864 lined up to deliver supplies. Connect to the supplies, take them out. So that's there in Nashville. It was independent of the officer chain of command from the regular Army. And this was important because it prevented disorder from field officer special requests. So someone said, I need this right now, and USMR says, no you don't. Things get sent where we know that they are needed according to organization and numbers that we've got. It also oversaw railway construction and repair. And so General Haupt and his teams mastered rail bridge construction. They were able to do it very quickly over the course of the war because they got a lot of practice. The Potomac Creek Bridge had 10 to 20 trains going over it every day after it was rebuilt. So they knew what they were doing, which is pretty amazing there. And they also created and maintained new lines. So this is the excavating for the Y junction at the Devereaux Station. There's General Haupt right there, standing overseeing the work crew as they expand the line to create the Y junction there. Yes?
Did the military have the authority to take over private rail stop?
So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So that's an excellent question. It's an excellent question. So on the Union side, we also have the Great Locomotive Chase. How many of you have heard of this before? Okay. April 12th, 1862. It's also called the Andrews Raid. Maybe you've heard of it by that name. It was a 91-mile chase across Georgia. Union soldiers and 2 civilians stole a Confederate locomotive called the General. And they were chased by 3 locomotives and a hand-track car for 91 miles. But they were all captured after abandoning the train. And 19 were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, some of them posthumously because they were executed by the Confederacy. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on that. This will take us to the National Medal of Honor Museum, where you can see some of these soldiers that were involved in the raid. Okay, so that's Andrews. It's not showing up on your screen there. Reconnect, that's always fun when technology doesn't do what it's supposed to. Oh, no, it still doesn't want to do it. Okay, it's showing that it's there, but it's not showing it to you. Unfortunately, a hammer won't work.
Yes, it does.
Not the way I want it to. Okay. Here. It was fun when it just decides not to do what you tell it to.
May I make a comment while you're?
Sure, yes, go ahead.
If you're following the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, their logistics is based, the Russian army's logistics is based on being resupplied by railroad. So part of their initial attack on their battle plan was to take over the rail lines and the key junctions so that they would be able to resupply, and they have not been able to do that. So it's still, logistics supported by rail are still important in this day and age. There was a, MSAN had a great article about the guy who runs the Ukrainian railroad. He has to keep moving because the Russians are trying to kill him. Because he's kind of the brains behind keeping the Ukrainian army supplied. And he's having the same problem with destruction and vandalism that Leroy just mentioned a bit ago.
Okay, it shows that. Okay. That's gonna jump on me. Maybe I should actually.
Are you going to talk about what happened during the First World War with the railroads, or is that?
The First World War? No.
Okay,
Okay.
but in the First World War, there was an organization called the United States Railway Administration. They The government took over the private network of railroads in World War I to speed the logistical support, and then I'll shut up because
No, no, it's okay.
that didn't work too well either.
Nope, nope, it didn't. Just to tell you some names here. So Private William Bensinger, Private Wilson Brown, Private Robert Buffum, Corporal Daniel Dorsey, Corporal Martin Hawkins, Private William Knight, Sergeant Elihu Mason, Private Jacob Parrott, Sergeant William Pittenger, Private John Porter, Corporal William Reddick, Private Samuel Robertson, Sergeant Major Marion Ross, Sergeant John Scott, Private Samuel Slavins, Private James Smith, Private John Wilson, Private John Woolham, Private Mark Wood. And the general is still displayed at the Southern Museum of Civil War and Locomotive History in Georgia. So it's still there, restored, obviously, but you can go and see it, and it looks very similar to how it is in the picture here. So, but yeah, they snuck down, stole a locomotive, got chased. Some of them were killed, some were later released as prisoners, but they were some of the first people to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. This was one of the first dispenses of that.
Leroy,
Yes.
do you have info there as to which city in Georgia that's displayed at?
Kennesaw.
In Kennesaw?
In Kennesaw.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Did they steal it for their own use or just to deprive the Confederacy of
Both.
it? Okay.
Union train wrecks. So we're going to talk about two that happened. First was September 3rd, 1861. It was the Platte River outside St. Joseph, Missouri. Confederate bushwhackers sabotaged the bridge. And it was a civilian train with men, women, and children, but there were Union soldiers traveling on the train, between 17 and 20 dead. The second was July 15th, 1864. So the first one you can see was directly a result of the war itself. The second one happened outside Shahola, New York. It was a station keeper error. He gave the incorrect signal for whether the track was clear or not. And a U.S. military railway train carrying prisoners of war collided with a loaded coal train, both at full speed. At least 68 dead, including 17 Union soldiers and over 50 Confederate prisoners, were killed in this collision in New York State. So one of the nastier train wrecks during the war, and later we'll look at some of the Confederate train wrecks. But those are the big ones that happened on the Union side. So in contrast, Confederate railways were underutilized. And a big reason for this was until 1864, civilian passenger and commercial train use was given priority over military operation. The regular trains just kept running. So people traveling from town to town and whatnot. So the military didn't even use it that much for most of the war. The Confederacy also lost the support of rail companies, and so many rail companies voluntarily allowed the Union to use them, and some, like the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, initially supported the Confederacy, but a lot of their main lines were right along the boundary between the Union and Confederate territories. But Stonewall Jackson led a destructive raid on Union rail lines in northern Virginia, which were primarily B&O lines, causing $2.5 million in damage. So in today's money, that's over $43 million. And so B&O quickly changed their tune after that destruction and said, yeah, the Union can use it. So the Union, the USMR could lay new track, but they utilized the track of private companies, but they built their own engines and either used or rented trains. It took 10 months to repair the damage from that raid. They had no centralized planning or control of railway use, so nothing like the military railroad. And part of that is because in the South there was a mindset of independent states working together. It was a confederacy. very different from the Union. And the Louisville and Nashville Railway was nearly completely destroyed in the war. And so a big contrast to the way the Union utilized the railway, the perspective they had in planning and utilizing it. So Confederate train wrecks. This list is a bit longer than the Union list, and you'll see why in a bit. So our first one is February 27, 1862, at Ponchatoula, Louisiana. A southbound lumber train head-on collided with a northbound military train in heavy fog. 28 dead. Our second one, October 19th, 1862, at Duck Hill, Mississippi. A head-on collision of fast-moving southbound military train with slow-moving northbound civilian train. 35 dead, almost all soldiers on the military train. November 4th, 1862, this was a bad year for Confederate Railways. At Fort Hill, Ohio, 17 dead. The details on this one were a bit scarce. It's possible that the train wreck was caused by Union artillery. I was not able to find confirmed information on that. And then December 31st, 1862, so we snuck in a fourth one that year, at Edwards Depot in Mississippi. A train with 4 cars of Confederate soldiers were derailed by bad track. The gauges didn't line up, and the train derailed. And you can see an etching that was done. Some dead, not too many, but many wounded soldiers as a result of the crash. And then February 19th, 1863, in Chunky Creek, Mississippi, a 3 a.m. plunge into a river after trying to cross a bridge damaged by flooding. And so they couldn't get to the signal, they didn't see the signal, just going right along. The bridge had been damaged by floodwaters and it just straight into the river. And so there were more than 40 dead from that train wreck. Here's some interesting comparative numbers, north versus south. So the number of U.S. military railroad locomotives was 419. And the total rolling stock, meaning actually in use, of the military railroad was 6,330. The mileage operated by the military railroad was 2,105 miles. Now you compare that to the total mileage available, it's not much, but remember, there's only those 4 connecting lines between the north and the south. The average cost in the north for a new 440 locomotive was $10,000 at the time. There were 6 railroads serving Richmond, Virginia, but not one of them interchanged with the other. So 6 railroads and none of them connected to each other at all. So not great planning, not at all.
It's like Boston.
So the average rail weight per yard during the Civil War was 60 pounds. Today it's roughly twice as heavy. So a lot lighter.
3 times now.
3 times now? Wow. So the amount of rail produced annually by the North and the South at the start of the war, 220,000 rails versus 26,000 rails. And the amount of rail and number of locomotives produced in the South after the war began, none.
Well, the railroads in the South were competing with the Confederate Navy because they used a lot of railroad iron and the casemates on their
It's true.
iron plants.
During the conflict, the North added 4,000 miles of rail, and the South only added 400. And the average cost of new cast iron wheels in the South compared in 1861 compared to 1865, from $15 to $500, which is more than a 3,000% increase. I want to say that's
Is that Confederate money?
That's a good question. So you see the amount invested into the railroad, in addition to what they started with, was a really big difference as far as what was made available there. So now we get to the impact of the railways on the war. And so first, many major battles happened near railroad junctions. And the reason why is because you could move a lot of troops there, and where there are a lot of troops, that's where you had the battles. They were instrumental in several Confederate victories. The first Battle of Bull Run, Joe Johnston used the Manassas Gap Railroad to outmaneuver Union troops by bringing them in. And the Battle of Chickamauga as well, in which Longstreet moved 12,000 troops from Virginia to Georgia to reinforce the Confederate position. And so the Confederacy did learn how to use the railroad, but not nearly as effectively as the Union did. On the other hand, it was instrumental in a lot of Union victories. The Battle of Philippi was one of the first. The speedy movement of troops caught the enemy by surprise, and it was a pretty good sneak attack there. Greater troop and supply mobility, just able to move a lot more and a lot faster, and a lot farther, and more supplies available more quickly and more securely. So to contrast this, trains could at this time travel up to 60 miles an hour on a straight level track, but averaged 20 miles an hour. But a train doesn't get tired. And so it can do 20 miles an hour as long as you're feeding coal. And so you could move tons and tons very quickly with a troll, comparatively to marching troops' average marching speed, when well-trained and with good terrain, was 4 to 5 miles an hour. And that's not counting if you have bad weather conditions. And so exponentially better in terms of what they could accomplish. And so it had a really big impact. So I found this very interesting, a lot of neat points as far as how the railway impacted things. Not a super long presentation today, but does anybody have any questions? Anyone have any questions?
Well, I'm looking at that 4 to 5 mile per hour.
That's a nice estimate.
That's I take a work capacity test every year. You have to carry weight on your back, and it's a 4 mile an hour pace for that. Then I would challenge that because
Yeah, this isn't long distance. No, definitely not. And
Obviously, ideal conditions.
Ideal conditions, yeah, ideal conditions.
To make 4 miles an hour without any weight on you, and crappy footwear and.
And so as we think about that, well-trained with good terrain, there was not good terrain in most places they
Somebody
went.
you with a bayonet.
Right. And the other thing is that, a lot of troops, especially at the beginning of the war, were not well-trained. And so it might have been a lot slower than that. And so, especially at the start of the war, the railroad really gave the Union a big advantage in that point.
There was a question earlier here about the, I don't know if it was commandeering or the use of trains,
Yep.
track, and equipment,
Yeah.
all of that, as far as the government doing that type of thing.
Yeah, and so I think I had answered that, but I'll repeat it.
I'm slow, you have
It's
to
okay, it's
go over
okay.
a second
Yep.
time sometimes.
So the Union built their own rail cars, and the military railroad also laid their own track. But they did utilize private companies allowed them to do that. And I'd have to dig more into quartermaster records to see what kind of payment they gave for that. But they built their own rail cars to use.
Just a comment, it just boggles my mind, the logistics of caring for 12,000 troops. I mean, they gotta go to the bathroom, they gotta be fed, I mean, it's just mind-boggling.
Right? And you think about how some battles had, upwards of over 50,000 men. That's a lot of mouths to feed. That's a lot of supplies for tents, latrine, ammunition, You think about moving gunpowder, that makes me really nervous. You know, what they had to do to ensure that that worked out. And you know, during the war, those Confederate bushwhackers were constantly going around trying to destroy Union rail bridges all throughout Tennessee and Kentucky. And so General Haupt and the engineering teams really got good at rebuilding those rail bridges, but also there were a number of units that were assigned specifically to patrol duty to protect the railroad bridges.
Several of the Minnesota regiments.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and so, yeah, they were really key points as far as logistics go.
One more for you. When you talked about the Confederacy still running up till 1864 with, you know, pretty much regular train traffic,
Yeah.
I'm wondering reasons being, was part of that just financial and that the railroads could still make money off of the civilian population, whereas the government couldn't afford to pay them?
That's a good question. And from what I've been able to ascertain, at least one of the really big reasons was that even though there was a Confederate government, that each of the states had their own policies. And because trains had interstate traffic, there just wasn't a good regulation of it. And so the train companies themselves were still allowed to just operate.
Yeah, because I know I read a biography a couple of years ago of Jefferson Davis, and I don't remember a lot of it just because it's several years ago, but I remember one of the things that it just drove him crazy because he had very little power, comparatively speaking, like Abraham Lincoln.
Yep.
And Lincoln had his own problems, but as far as all kinds of things with states' rights and whatever, but one of them being with the railroad thing, something I remember reading about that.
Now, if I back up a bit, there's a little bit more that I can talk about here. So the Duck Hill, Mississippi Railroad crash was interesting because of these, it has probably the most personal accounts that were written about it. There was a clergyman who was traveling on the northbound civilian train. And so the northbound civilian train had been at the station at Duck Hill and had just started off and was not far past the station, maybe a couple miles, when the southbound train, moving fast, it didn't switch lines and just impacted. And so this clergyman, he was a few cars back in the southbound train and talks about the moment of impact and how everything was thrown around and how the cars crashed down, and it was just the chaos that was involved in a train wreck. I mean, train wrecks today are just as awful, but considering, especially for these ones in the South, remember, they had much fewer telegraph lines for communication, for asking for help for things, and so especially if a train wreck happened not in town, but out a ways, the people there, injured and wounded, could face a pretty long wait for receiving, medical aid or help, and so some really interesting things there. I think that the train wrecks were some of the most interesting that I read about, and with the Union train wrecks, if I back up here. Whereas on the southern train wrecks, we have derailings, we have crashes, but none of them were caused by Union action. Whereas in the Union, one of them was caused by Confederate saboteurs, and the St. Joseph, Missouri was actually laid siege by Union troops, and numerous times asked the people to give up the perpetrators of this act, and they refused to do so. So there's a lot of tension with that incident that happened, and with the news at the time, because this came out originally in the newspaper, this etching of what happened. They sabotaged the bridge, they lit the supports on fire, and caused the train to crash into the river, it definitely did not help the Confederate cause as far as people's perception. And of course, there are apologists for the so-called lost cause that say that it was legitimate because there were Union soldiers on the train as a military action, but it was not a Union troop train or Union supply train. It was a civilian train that happened to have soldiers on it that were traveling to where they were supposed to report for duty. Any other comments or questions?
I just wanted to make a comment, and you did an outstanding job. It was very informational, and thank you. It was especially interesting for me because I was a freight conductor for 42 years.
Okay.
So it's very good, outstanding.
Anything you'd like to add then?
Well, we were in Atlanta a few years ago visiting relatives, and we saw this amazing thing. It's called a circle-rama. And that Atlanta was a real hub.
Was there much cooperation with the, either side that, like when new recruits would come in, did they get a ride to where they were supposed to assemble? Did they all pay their own way? Did the government pay their way? What?
I think initially to get to where they were supposed to report, they had to pay their way to get there because they had to travel. But once they were actually, mustered in and assigned to units and whatnot, then the Union Army paid for the transportation at that point. And those rail lines in the north really help facilitate more units being called in from places like Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois to be able to get to points where they could be involved in combat much more quickly. Yeah. Like I said, it was a little bit shorter today, but I thought there were some really interesting points there, things that I didn't know before, so I was grateful for that. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
And we've got 2 more meetings before we finish for the summer, as it were, April and May. We do not have any presenters lined up at this point, and so if you have a suggestion, please let me know, and I'd be happy to arrange what I can to put it together.